All right, thank you all for being here. Let me get my screen share set up. That looks like it's working on my end. Super, thank you all so much for being here. My name is Amanda Montoya, and I'm joined by my colleague, William Krenzer, who's going to be manning the chat. So if you have questions as we're going through, I will also have time where we stop for questions. But if you have something burning right away, he is there directly in the chat to help respond. So yeah, thank you, William, for being here. And today we're going to be talking about promoting reproducibility in Africa, pre-registration, and registered reports. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's something that I love a lot, and I feel really grateful for the opportunity to come and speak on this here today. Let me make sure, okay, I have the right microphone connected. Great. Basically today we're gonna give a little intro to ourselves and our perspective. William and I both come from psychology, and that has, certain background in it, just to give you a sense of kind of where we're coming from and what we've been doing in this space. And then I'm going to give some basics on pre-registration and registered reports, what they are, when you do them, where you do them. And then we'll have a section where we do a little bit of comparing and contrasting between the two approaches, because it's very common, I think, especially when we're new to these topics or even old sometimes, to know what's the difference? When do I do one versus another? What are the advantages or disadvantages in any given context? And then we'll turn to some kind of more practical advice. So this is maybe a little bit more kind of just based on our experiences. These are things that we think seem to work well. And also talk about some of the special cases that we run into a lot when we are working directly with researchers, like qualitative research or secondary data analysis, these meta-analysis, these kinds of specific research methodologies that maybe don't very obviously fit into these approaches, but can actually fit quite well. And then we'll wrap up with some resources and Q&A, but please don't feel like you have to save your questions for the end. I think we'll have lots of time for really rich discussion, and I have a couple spots where we'll stop and kind of take a moment to think on, what we've just learned, and ask any questions that you have, but you also do not have to wait. You can put the question in the chat, and William will be on there. I've just put the link to the slides in the chat. William, maybe in like a couple minutes, maybe post it again, just in case we have a few folks who have logged in. Great. Super. So I just want to start with some brief introductions, and in a moment, William will introduce himself as well. My name is Amanda Montoya. I'm an associate professor of quantitative psychology at UCLA. My training has mostly been in psychology and statistics. So I received my bachelor's of science from the University of Washington, and a master's in statistics at Ohio State, and then a master's of arts and a PhD in psychology, also at Ohio State. So a lot of my work has really focused on statistical methods, and that is kind of how I got interested in open science and the way that statistics are used in a kind of daily basis by a researcher, not just developing new statistical methods. So that's been kind of the approach that I've had to this work. William, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is William Krenzer. I'm a research project manager within the Office of Scientific Integrity at Duke University. similar to Amanda, my background is in psychology. I did my bachelor's and my master's at San Francisco State, looking primarily at that time at psychophysiology and brainwaves and stuff like that. But then I did my PhD at DePaul University, where I did get more into experimental design questions and reproducibility questions and these kind of areas of how can we make science better within psychology. And I think that'll lead a segue to Amanda to the next kind of steps of how we met.
Yes,
So,
yeah. So William and I met, I think it's 2017 or 2018. It feels like ages ago now, at a meeting for the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. Um, I think it was actually a pre-conference at a social psychology meeting, but it was kind of a day-long meeting where we got to work on different kind of projects in open science and thinking about, what's going on in open science. And William and I met in a session where we talked about mentoring and kind of what students need in terms of mentorship to facilitate them using open science practices, and also, what training do mentors need? And I think both of us at the time were just wrapping up our PhDs and thinking about moving on to the next step. And so we were kind of uniquely positioned to both weigh in on what we wish we got as mentees, but also to really think about the opportunity of, as new faculty or researchers setting up a new research environment, what kinds of things could we do to really facilitate reproducibility and transparency in a kind of new environment. So actually, it's funny, on all of my computers and folders and everywhere that I save things related to this project, it's called Starting an Open Science Lab, where really the idea was, as a new faculty member or a new researcher kind of starting out a lab, what kinds of things could we do to prepare people for that? And I think a lot of this comes from this feeling that William and I shared, which was that our labs, when we were in graduate school, were not very focused on reproducibility and transparency. Um, and so neither of us felt particularly prepared to start a lab that was really putting those values forward. So we kind of started thinking about, like, how would we do that? And I think most of our research thus far has really focused on registered reports, and I'll talk about why that is. But I think largely the goal of what we're doing is trying to kind of give people the tools to facilitate adopting these practices at whatever point they are in their careers, but also in particular for people who are early in their career. Um, and I think especially there's this kind of mass of people who see the value, who see the benefits, but they just don't know how, right? And so that, I think, is an environment that we share. So thus far, our lab has, or this kind of research project has been supported by two US National Science Foundation grants, and we've been very lucky to keep those. It's Friday though, so knock on wood. But we've been really, really lucky to get some funding from our government to study these issues and to pursue a better understanding of how people are adopting open science practices and create resources for folks who are interested. So I feel very grateful that we were asked to be here today and to share our knowledge with you, but also I think just both of us are very much in the kind of research mindset as well. So we're really excited to learn more from you about your own experiences and the barriers that you have experienced. We've done a number of focus groups with researchers trying to understand not just are these things good, but also in what ways could they be better? So we're always really, really interested in kind of hearing from folks about their own experiences. So Thank you so much for having us today, and we're really, really excited to be here. So one thing that you might be wondering, just in terms of our trajectory, is why were both of us even at an open science symposium? And I think for me personally, and also for William, one of the driving things that really got me into this space was this discussion of these ideas of questionable research practices. And even as an undergraduate, I had kind of experiences with these concerns that some people are using practices to kind of get ahead, and other people who are trying to do the right thing are kind of left behind. So I really love this definition of QRPs, which is that they're the steroids of scientific competition, artificially enhancing performance and producing a kind of arms race in which researchers who strictly play by the rules are at a competitive disadvantage. Um, and I think that this is something I like to keep in mind, because in my mind, I almost want this, like the reverse of this, to apply to open science practices where, as people start adopting these new practices, that's a different way to get ahead, but a much more transparent and reproducible and rigorous way to exemplify quality research. Um, so I think both of us had these kind of experiences where we were encouraged to or saw other people really adopting some of these practices. So for example, something we might call p-hacking, which doesn't necessarily have to be p-values, like whatever evidence we use in our research, there are always ways to kind of push things in a direction. And so these are things like running many different analyses and kind of adjusting analyses until you find something that is really, that you feel like is very publishable. And a lot of the time that's somebody outside of you maybe weighing in on what's publishable. I just had a meeting with a graduate student yesterday that was very concerned because her advisor kept asking her to do all these different analyses, and that's a very kind of common story. Um, Another questionable research practice that I find super interesting, and I remember experiencing a lot actually when I was an undergrad, is hypothesizing after results are known. So I love this little comic because clearly this guy has shot through this board, and then he's drawing the targets around where the holes are. And this is, I think, a very common experience where, and I even got this advice like early on, which is like, write your introduction section after you know what happens in your study. And it's this idea of kind of setting up your hypotheses to align with the results rather than identifying your hypotheses and then testing them using your methods. So this is a pretty common one we call harking, which is a kind of funny name, but I really like the abbreviation and the idea. Well, not the idea, but the I think the comic is funny. Um, and then another issue that we run into is publication bias, and publication bias is this idea that there are certain types of results that are more publishable than not. And what I want to emphasize here is that the idea of publication bias is that not that certain research topics or research programs are more publishable than not, or even certain research methods, but that the decision of whether to publish a result could really depend on how the study came out. So even if you're using, the best methods, you're doing very rigorous science, just depending on the outcome of the study, all of a sudden the study is publishable or not. And so I like this comment that says, and this is where we put the non-significant results, where we're filing away a lot of these non-publishable results, even though they may have been implemented with some of the best methods that we could muster at the time. And publication bias in many senses kind of drives both p-hacking and harking, which is this perspective that certain types of things are more publishable than not. So with p-hacking, finding evidence for an effect seems to be more publishable, and also finding evidence that aligns with your hypotheses seems to be more publishable. So we can see how p-hacking and harking kind of both are driven by publication bias, really, and this perception of we know what's publishable and we know it's not, so we're going to make our work publishable by using these questionable research practices. Um, so when we start thinking about these questionable research practices, I don't know, I find it a little depressing sometimes. You're running into all of these instances of using these practices and people feeling pressured to use these practices. And so to me, open science is really the like converse of these practices, where there's a number of different goals in open science. So um, one of the experiences that I had pretty early in my career was that I was trying to learn how to do statistical analyses, and I went to my mentor and I really want to learn how to do all the statistics that we do in the lab. So she asked me to reproduce all of the analyses in a recent paper that was published from the lab. So she gave me the data and then said, just reanalyze the data, and you should find all the same numbers of what was in the paper. And this is, I think, a really great example of something that we call reproducibility, which is this idea that you should be able to conduct the same analysis with the same data and get the same result. And actually, in the first study that I did that in, we found some small errors in the paper. In particular, it was a paper that had to do with race, and there was a person who had written in that they were Australian, and the original analyst had put them in the white category. And then we had a big discussion in the lab about whether that was a good classification of such a person. So really, one of the things that drew me into this idea is that reproducibility is in many senses just a kind of minimal expectation of scientific research. If we see something that's published in the literature, we should expect that if we did the same analyses with the same data, we would get the same results. I think that this is in many senses a commitment that we make to our readership, whether that's other scientists or the public or whoever it is, that we have done kind of the bare minimum of quality checking of our own work. And it sounds, I think, maybe a little obvious, but it's not something that many fields have really prioritized. And in many fields, it is actually quite difficult to ensure reproducibility. I have a colleague who is a atmospheric scientist, and he does research on chaos theory, and his simulations take, many, many days to run on a supercomputer. And so the idea of reproducibility for him is quite difficult because it's resource intensive, even just to check that his work is reproducible. The other thing that I think is really valuable that comes from the values of open science is replicability, this idea that we can repeat the same research process and get the same result. And these two terms have been used kind of interchangeably over time. I think for the most part, we've kind of landed on these two kind of distinctions of reproducibility being same analysis with same data, replicability being kind of a new analysis with, or could be the same analysis with new data primarily. And so replicability, I think, as a general idea, is really important because we want to know that our results are reliable. I always think of when I was in high school, I took this chemistry class, and and every single lab group was at the bench, and we were all doing the same thing, and we all got pretty much the same results. We made a solution, and then we weighed, the stuff that came out, and it should all come out to about the same thing. Um, But replicability is not necessarily guaranteed. So it's a goal, it's an ideal, but it's not always expected or achievable, even in the best scientific environments. So, it's always possible to make a type 1 error, a type 2 error. It's always possible to make some kind of methodological error that hopefully we would catch these things, but it's not always going to happen. Um, so in many systems, our goal is to develop a system or a process that's going to maximize replicability, where what we want is we want a set of tools, a set of methods, a set of ways of going about doing research where we feel like replicability is maximized, right? Where the most studies possible are going to be replicable, but acknowledging that each individual study may not always be replicable. We sometimes are going to make errors as scientists, and that's a normal experience. So this makes you kind of wonder, well, like, are we there yet? Is always kind of the question the kids ask in the back seat. And there was this really interesting study that was conducted by the Open Science Collaboration it was published in 2015. They started in 2012. And they looked at a set of 100 studies that were all conducted in psychology. And you can even see the swapping of the language here. So this is early days open science. The study was called Estimating the Reproducibility of Psychological Science. I think if it was written today, we would call it Estimating the Replicability of Psychological Science. Um, but in the original studies they looked at, it's almost even hard to see on this little graph because the p-values for all of the effects are all stacked in this little tiny area, less than 0.05 for the most part. And this tends to be the type of evidence that at least psychological science is looking for in order to determine what to publish, is p-values less than typically 0.05. In the study, what they did is they conducted multiple replications of each of these studies. And very interestingly, this is the distribution of p-values that they found from the replications. And so what we're seeing here is that when we try to redo these studies, we're not finding the same evidence intensity in particular, to support the claims that were made in the paper. So this was a study that came out kind of around, I don't know, would have been like early days graduate school for me. And I was really struck by these results where I really thought like, oh, if we p-values are strong evidence for research, findings, and it was really kind of discouraging to me to see that in psychological science, at the very least, the system that we're using for deciding what to publish and what not to publish is just not working well. Ideally, if we did this kind of replication project again, we would see that we're getting very similar results with the replications. Maybe not every study is going to replicate. That's totally normal. But in this study, it was like less than 33%, depending on kind of what threshold you use for a determination. So to me, this was an indication that whatever system we're using to decide what to publish or not to publish is just not really working. The other aspect that I think is super important is thinking about early career researchers and trainees. So the people who are really on the ground doing the research, doing the writing, doing a lot of the work that goes into creating this system, right? So when we think about science as it's a human behavior in many senses, and so as a psychologist, I try to think about it in this way, where scientists are human and they have motivations. And what we find is that early career researchers, I think, really feel this heavy pressure to find results, to make things publishable, to really um, uh, push their research in a specific direction. And so I like this comment. It says, I have to fake my data with all these ethics seminars. I don't have time to do experiments. So this idea of there's, a lot of time pressure on early career researchers. So, in general, what we find is that, and the idea here is like, why do we focus on these folks? Um, Job attainment and security really requires publishing. I say this to my grad students a little, it's in a context, but the idea of you could do a lot of studies, but if you don't publish them, then no one will acknowledge all of the work that you've done. And that's really hard, I think, because as scientists, I like the doing of the research. Sometimes I get a little like bored with the writing part. I'm just like, well, now I know. I know the results, but I want other people to know too. So oftentimes this results in kind of pressure to find significant results or publishable results due to publication bias, is that you need to publish in order to get a job or maintain a job. Um, Early career researchers are at higher risk of using questionable research practices because they're in this more vulnerable state of their career. So a tenured professor is not necessarily going to feel the same pressure, although they have, in many senses, been formed by the current systems. And so we still see that it's not like, oh, it's all the ECRs and the tenured professors are just fine. They're doing everything by the book, but rather this feeling of pressure, I think, kind of encourages early career researchers to use these questionable research practices. Um, and some research that looks at research trainees, this study was specifically in biology, found that nearly kind of 2/3 of research trainees report that the way that they report their results is influenced by this feeling of the pressure to publish. So they are actively aware that they are changing the way that they report their analyses based on this feeling like I really need to publish. And incentives for early career researchers really don't align with adopting research practices. So there's often this feeling that I need to get stuff done fast, and open research practices maybe take longer. Hopefully today we'll try to convince you that some of these things don't take as long as many people think. But it doesn't always feel like it makes sense to adopt something new that might not necessarily help your career when we're already under all of this pressure. So I wanted to give this example because I think it's well, I love that Nick made this visual, but this to me is like, this is the system that we're working with, at least in psychology, where papers. So just to kind of orient you to this visual, they submitted a two-study paper to this journal JPSP, which is arguably a very top journal in social psychology. And then they got feedback that said, okay, you can resubmit the paper if you collect some new data. So they collected two more studies. So now they have four studies in one paper. And then it was rejected. So the journal kind of said, hey, do this work for us. And then they did the work. They pre-registered it even. And then the journal was just like, nah, which is very discouraging. So then they took this package and submitted it to one, two, three, four other journals before, and you can see the guy on the mood guy on the right just getting sadder and sadder, right? At each of these journals, it was rejected. The team kind of revisited the project and decided maybe we need to split it into two papers. One of these papers was submitted to one, two, three, four more journals. And then finally, it was revised and accepted. The second paper was submitted to one, two, three, four, five more journals. One of those asked for new data collection as well. They added another study, so now we're up to five studies. The original was two, and then finally it's accepted. And this looks really extreme, but in talking to researchers, I think this is actually a very common experience, this idea of journal shopping or submitting to a lot of journals. Journals will ask for new data collection, which is quite a lot of work, and then not really accept that work. So researchers are really kind of at the mercy of the journals in a way that I think is pretty discouraging, I think sometimes. Um, so to me, the system also isn't working for researchers. So the system that we have is not producing replicable science, but it's also really not working for researchers in that they're trying to do the right thing, and the system that we have in place is not necessarily addressing or acknowledging that additional work. Right. So here I think they collected like 3 additional pre-registered studies, but still had to submit to something like 15 journals. So it's a lot of work for researchers, and I think that is one of the things that is very kind of discouraging about whatever's going on currently, or I might even say like 10 years ago, because this is a little old. Um, so when William and I got together, we started thinking about like what's the biggest thing that you could do as a new PI or a new lab uh, somebody who's managing a lab or running a lab. Like once you're at the driver's seat, what do you do? Um, and to us, I think it was really clear that pre-registration was really, really valuable in terms of establishing your plans ahead of time in terms of your research. So pre-registration is this idea that prior to collecting your data or conducting a research project, whatever that might look like in your field, you create a public or embargoed, and we'll talk about what that means, but essentially it will become public eventually, but doesn't have to become public right away, registration of your research plans. And so pre-registration has been around actually for quite a while. And it's really picked up in a lot of different fields, just as a way of establishing, a research plan in a transparent way. Um, when we talked about pre-registration, we were like, yes, this is really valuable. It's so great. But it doesn't get at this issue that kind of comic had where, well, it's not really comic, it's real, which is you can pre-register things, but journals don't have to publish it. And to us, that was a really discouraging aspect of pre-registration. So we wanted to go kind of even further and talk about registered reports, which is essentially, it's a 2-stage publication process where the plan for data collection and analysis undergoes peer review, and the journal accepts the paper based on that proposal. So what we'll call a stage 1 rather than the results. And this to me, I think is like the end all be all of new things to adopt. But there are still some limitations in the way that this is being implemented. It's still relatively new. So we're going to talk about both of these practices today in terms of how do they work, what do we do, and I think both of them are just super impactful in terms of the way that we can make our research more replicable, more reproducible, and more transparent. So we were pretty well decided that these 2 practices really, really facilitate open science. And one of the things that's really neat is that a lot of these practices kind of help you adopt other practices. So with a lot of journals, registered reports kind of require open data or code. Um, but there are also some problems. So in particular, they're pretty disruptive to the typical process. So it's not something that you can just add on at the end. It's something that you have to think about in advance. So when we're talking about, starting a lab or running your own lab, you really have to have the tools in place to do this at the right time. Um, it's also difficult to learn. So these things are not necessarily stuff that you're going to learn in your graduate training or undergraduate training. A lot of this is changing. Where I have a trainee who's in a professional development session. They had 1 day on open science, and I was so happy. But this idea that this is not part of the normal curriculum for a scientist necessarily. And then the last thing is that it's unclear how to implement these things. So this is kind of where William and I came in and said, we really want to train people in these practices, and also make resources to try to make these things easier. So let's talk about pre-registration and registered reports, and we're kind of just going to go through the what, who, when, where, why of each of these. I want to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions so far, just in terms of kind of why we do what we do, where we do what we do, how we do what we do. I don't see anything in the chat. Okay. Okay. So we're going to start with pre-registration. So what is it? I've already said the idea is essentially prior to data collection or conducting a research project, whatever that might look like. So if the data already exists somewhere, maybe access it prior to accessing the data, you're going to create a public or embargoed registration of a research plan. So a core element of this is that it's something that other people can access, but it doesn't necessarily have to be something that other people can access right away. Because I know this is a common concern with pre-registration, is this idea of, well, if I make this open immediately, then somebody else might do my project. And that is not really something that we have to worry about given the way that these systems are set up. But it didn't start like that. So I think that that's part of the trouble is it took a while for some of the online systems to figure this out. So one of the things that's really important about a pre-registration is that it's time-stamped. So it needs to be clear when the registration was made, and it shouldn't be possible to change that in any way. So it needs to typically be online in some shape where someone can confirm when the study was pre-registered. And it typically includes a number of different elements, especially depending on the type of research that you do. These elements might look a little different. I've included a list that's kind of common for psychology research, but different fields are going to have kind of different expectations of what goes into a pre-registration. So one thing that to always include is your hypotheses. So one of the things that we talked about, like with harking, is that you could change your hypotheses to match your results. So the idea with a pre-registration is you can put your hypotheses in here so that it's clear that these were your hypotheses before you actually conducted the research. So this should allow for detection of harking. If somebody does a pre-registration and then changes their hypotheses, we should be able to identify that. Some kind of sample size planning. So whether your sample is people or samples from the moon, or I have a colleague who we go out to see some dunes on the weekend and we collect dust. Whatever the sample is, there should be a plan for how many or how much of a sample you need in order to do your research. This is particularly important because a lot of the kind of p-hacking and other kind of analysis aspects of questionable research practices have to do with kind of adjusting your sample size. The key variables that you are collecting and how they're measured and also how they're aggregated. So, if you know that you're going to be collecting different pieces of information, but then when you do your analysis, how you'll kind of combine them together or evaluate how you'll combine them together, that's super important. Any experimental conditions. So if you're doing an experiment, what are the conditions that you're going to be running your cases in? And what do those conditions look like? What do the procedures for those conditions look like? Just the general kind of process that's used for data collection. Any exclusion and inclusion criteria. So this is a common concern that has come out of these questionable research practices is kind of selectively excluding or including people because they might be inconsistent with your hypotheses. So establishing your exclusion and inclusion criteria prior to actually doing the research is very important. And then the analysis plan. And I just want to point out that it is 100% possible to do a pre-registration without an analysis plan. And there's actually, in many senses, and in many contexts, reasons to do that. So we'll talk a little bit about badges later, but I just wanted to acknowledge that like you could do everything above analysis plan and that would still be a pre-registration. And in fact, some journals, they use these little badges to indicate what's pre-registered and what's not. And the idea is a pre-registration plus an analysis plan is like an extra thing. So even if the analysis plan isn't fully fleshed out, you can still pre-register with all of the elements above, and that's still a valid pre-registration. I do think it's really valuable to think about your analysis plan in advance, just because sometimes we plan to do analyses that we can't do with the data that we are planning on collecting. I've done that with a registered report, actually, and it was kind of embarrassing, but it all ended up okay. I work with a group of people who are doing these like very long randomized control trials. And typically they don't hire the statistician until the data is like mostly collected. So they can't really write their analysis plan until that person is hired, because that person is really the person who's going to do the analyses. So it is totally okay to do a pre-registration without an analysis plan. It's like the little plus in this pre-registered badge. So who does the pre-registration? I think this is a key thing because often it's whoever is going to be doing the research, but who's involved in this process? So pre-registration can be done completely internally to your research team. You don't need someone to review your pre-registration. It doesn't get approved by anybody outside of your research team. It's just internal to your research team. I would say typically whoever is maybe like the first author on the paper, kind of the lead on the paper, is going to draft a pre-registration. It doesn't require any special permission or connection to a journal. It's just something that you can do. You don't need extra people, which is great. Even if one of the authors or the lead author writes the pre-registration, everybody who's involved in the project at that time should approve it before submitting it. And this will deal with, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as well, disagreements that happen on teams where, you know, one person says, oh, I thought we were doing this, and the other person says, no, we're actually doing this. And a pre-registration is a great time to kind of adjudicate those things so that like it's all written down what the procedures are, and you can agree on everything before you actually do it. I tend to recommend this to especially our graduate students who are like, oh, my advisor keeps changing my methods. At some point, if you do a pre-registration, then you've agreed on all of the steps that you need to do. It's written down, and the mentor has agreed on this. So hopefully this document can actually help the trainee or the early career researcher who is actually implementing these things. And then if you typically seek some kind of external assistance, so I know a lot of folks in biomedical fields will often work with a statistician. It's a great idea to get them to review the pre-registration as well. So especially if you have an analysis plan, for example, it's great to get their perspective early on before the data is actually collected, because they might be able to identify any issues that might come up, and you can kind of revise internally as a team. So don't wait to hire your statistician. So when do we do this? When does pre-registration happen? On the right here, we have the, I don't know, very famous kind of idea of the scientific process, where we're hypothesizing and then we're conducting research. we're getting results, and then that is informing our theory. So the idea is that pre-registration happens after we've listed and kind of identified our hypotheses, and after we've designed a study, but before we actually conduct the study. So pre-registration should happen prior to collecting or accessing the data. I know some folks here might do secondary data analysis, which is super important and definitely something that you can do a pre-registration with. Um, Sometimes there's also justifiable reasons to pre-register after data is collected, but before it's analyzed. Actually, we'll talk about one system for pre-registering, but the Open Science Framework allows you to update your pre-registration. So um, I was working on a study that was pre-registered, and we planned for some missing data, but there were some issues that came up where essentially we were administering these surveys in people's homes, and one of the people who, or I guess the copies of the sheets, one of the pages was missing out of the interview book. And so we had a large group of people who were missing a set of measures. And that really affected the way that we planned on doing our analyses. And so we were able to identify that that happened before we analyzed the data. So we updated the pre-registration. And so there's kind of different versions that you can see, and all of them are time-stamped and very clear, where you can say, this unexpected thing happened during data collection, which kind of changes the way that we want to analyze the data. So the main thing here is just be transparent. Give yourself time to do a pre-registration. So this should be part of kind of the planning process. Uh, um, I don't know, depending on kind of level of experience, some people can just like whip one of these out in a couple hours, and other people might perseverate on them for many days. Especially if you have a big team and you want to float the pre-registration by different people, you want to kind of plan for that time to evaluate it internally. Um, and a solid pre-registration can often take many revisions across authors. So especially if you're floating it with different people, you might have to revise it multiple times. While that feels like it takes a lot of time, it's oftentimes saving for later. So you're adjudicating a lot of maybe disagreements that might happen among the authors later in the process. And honestly, I feel like pre-registration saves me a lot of time because it keeps me from making mistakes that I would otherwise make. So think about it as time saving for later. Okay, so where do we pre-register? I've already mentioned that these typically go somewhere on the internet, just floating out in the interwebs. There's two primary places that people will pre-register. There are other places as well, but these seem to be the most common, so I wanted to kind of review these. So the first is the Open Science Framework, and they have a pre-registration page where you can essentially write in these pre-registrations. The Open Science Framework system has a lot of freedom, so it's very kind of free form in many senses. They don't have any word counts, and you can connect them to other Open Science Framework projects. If you haven't heard of the Open Science Framework before, it's a online kind of research project management system that really puts transparency and reproducibility forward. So the idea is you can host files related to your projects or materials, or your registrations can go on there, and your preprints can go on there, and everything can be connected, which is really super lovely. And so the OSF, the way that it works is that you can embargo a project for up to 4 years. So you can, when you do the registration, you can keep it private for up to 4 years. And I'd like to think that that's typically enough time to do some projects, but William and I have a project, I think, that's been running for about 4 years. And so I think the registration became open recently, which is fine with me. But yeah, so that's kind of the way the OSF works. They have a bunch of these there's a lot of different templates for doing the pre-registration, which is really nice because some of them are kind of designed to align with certain methods. So for example, there's a qualitative pre-registration, and so that's going to ask for different elements than the OSF pre-registration is kind of the kind of outline that I gave before. There's one that's for secondary data, so the data is already collected. And there's a bunch more of these actually than what's listed here. But the idea is that there are different kind of forms that you can use, and you can kind of explore these and find a form that jives with your approach. So that's pretty cool. The other place that these are hosted is called As Predicted. This was developed pretty early days, actually, like prior to OSF in many senses. And it's very aimed at experimental research. So if you're not doing experimental research, you might look at the options that are on there and just be like, this doesn't fit with my work, and that's totally reasonable. Some people really like this one because it's quite short, and so it feels easier, I think. They do have a limited word count in the different fields, which can be difficult. I did one of these a number of years ago where we were trying to describe a very complex analysis, and we kept running into these word limits that were tricky. One advantage of As Predicted is that there's no embargo period. So OSF, once you do the registration, it becomes publicly available for after 4 years. And but with As Predicted, you can keep these private indefinitely. So especially if you have a project that you would expect maybe runs longer than 4 years, As Predicted could be a good option. As Predicted also has a very nice format where you can make an anonymized version of these for peer review. OSF also kind of has this, but I've noticed that it can unless you've done your files perfectly, then sometimes you can still be identified. So I think the As Predicted version is actually much better at making an anonymized version. So that's kind of a pro of that system. I just wanted to point to, obviously, I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's a number of different pre-registration templates for different kind of contexts. So there's one for secondary data analysis, systematic reviews, experience sampling methods. So this is things like studies where you are sending people surveys on a regular basis, or you're taking data from an Apple Watch or something like that. Qualitative research, and then there's one for infant research in particular. So there's a lot of these templates are out there, even if they're not even the little click boxes on OSF. You can use these in any context, and I find them to be quite helpful. So we've covered kind of the nuts and bolts of pre-registration, but I want to talk about why we would do a pre-registration. One of the things that I think is really important is that it reduces p-hacking. So this idea of if you have an analysis plan in your pre-registration, you have a plan. And we can, at the very least, hope that people would follow their plan. In many senses, if we don't follow our plan, or if there are reasonable deviations from our plan, we can also make those transparent, what the reasons for that were. So I don't say that it eliminates p-hacking, but I think in many senses it makes p-hacking more detectable, and so that should discourage people from p-hacking. It should also reduce hypothesizing after results are known. So this idea that if I make my hypotheses public and available to other people, then I can know for sure that these were their hypotheses in advance. It also, in some senses, opens a file drawer. So with like the OSF system, where these pre-registrations become public after 4 years, we can evaluate whether there is maybe like a pile of pre-registered research on, I don't know, some specific topic. And maybe it looks like there were a lot of studies done, but none of them got published. Then that could be an indication of some issues with publication bias. And actually, later I have a citation of a study that did exactly that, where they looked at all of these pre-registrations that became available and tried to kind of evaluate like what proportion of pre-registered research is getting published, which is quite interesting. Um, it also is helpful in terms of informing the difference between approaches that will inform our theories versus test our theories. So this is also sometimes described as exploratory versus confirmatory research, where we might do research that helps us develop our theories and ideas and generate hypotheses. And then there are other approaches where we might be testing a specific theory or hypothesis. And so when we have a pre-registration, we can really help distinguish between those two things. I find this particularly helpful because I'm a human being. And so I'm fallible and time passes and I forget what I thought before. So I really like pre-registrations because it keeps me accountable to myself in the sense that, and I'm guilty of this, like being in a meeting with a graduate student, didn't we have a hypothesis about this? And they say, no, it's not in the pre-registration. And I go, okay, that's that. I find it really helpful internally, but also externally for evaluating that aspect. Um, Another benefit is that some journals offer badges for this. And so these badges have been developed as kind of an incentive to try to get people to use more open science practices. I had no idea what fields people were in for this workshop. So I just pulled a bunch of different fields. We have archaeology, political science, microbiology, toxicology and chemistry, management. The majority of the journals that offer these are in psychology, but there are journals in other fields. I wanted to kind of highlight those, and there is a full list of these. The link is on the slides, and I think William has continued to post the link to the slides, so that's great. Yes, and then some of the journals will distinguish between pre-registered, which means that kind of the methods and procedures and hypotheses are pre-registered, and then pre-registered plus means that you have all of those things plus an analysis plan. So you can always do as much as you can in a given context. One of the things that I think is really important is that, again, we want to be setting up this system of doing science that we can be proud of as scientists. And I think, obviously, given the context of this series, one of those values is really reproducibility. And it might not be immediately apparent what it is that pre-registration does to help with reproducibility. So I wanted to kind of call attention to this. So one of the things that I find really helpful is that pre-registration gives our internal and external team members a record of the research plan prior to conducting the research. So I've already kind of talked about how in my own lab, we find these really helpful because we forget what we thought before or what our plans were. But also it gives us accountability to an external reader of our paper or reviewer of our research so that they can also see what the plan was originally. One of the kind of thoughts and approaches that I've taken to this is planning for someone else to conduct and analyze the study, which is this idea of like, could I write a plan that's so clear that that somebody else could pick this up and actually implement the study in the way that I intended, or as if doing it as I would have done it. And particularly for analysis plans, I find this super, super helpful because oftentimes we have turnover in our team and we need new people. And so we want to have these useful ways to kind of ensure that our research is going to go forward as intended. I think having a written plan helps labs function internally and just kind of having this document and the process of creating the document really makes sure that everybody is on the same page ahead of time. You can always remember and refer back to the plan. My graduate advisor was really kind of funny because he was not super into the idea of pre-registration. He always said, what's to stop me from just writing down my plan on a piece of paper and putting it in a box? And I was like, that sounds great. Even just doing that can be really helpful because you can always then go back and look at your own plan. doing this kind of formal pre-registration also gives you the kind of the external evaluation, which is helpful as well. I also find that these are helpful for settling disagreements among team members, is trying to make these decisions ahead of time before there's data to kind of futz around with. So I find that that's super helpful, especially for trainees, where you're working with a supervisor or somebody who can kind of ask you to do all these different things. Having a pre-registration kind of has something that you can rely on to really say, well, this was the plan. And I think it also protects trainees from forgetful mentors. So whether whether this is on purpose or not, and I myself can be sometimes forgetful, is that mentors might change their mind or kind of decide new things. And so having this pre-registration, I think, is really helpful for making sure that research projects continue to move forward. The other thing that pre-registration promotes is transparency. So this is kind of more of the external element of what it is that we do, is that Samin Vizier has been using this phrase a lot, but this idea of like, show me the work that you did. Don't just tell me what happened, which is kind of the current method for publishing. But instead, transparency is giving us the opportunity to show our readers what it is that we did. So I remember, especially early days, reading papers and they would say like, as hypothesized, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, really? Really? Did you really hypothesize that in advance? And so pre-registration gives you a way to really kind of put your flag in the ground and say like, yes, this was as hypothesized. Or you'll see this now in papers where people will say, as pre-registered or whatever. So it's really, I think, a great way to kind of add a lot of gravitas to your claims, which is really cool. So pre-registration allows for external verifications of your claims, especially in terms of what you planned a priori versus not. And availability of pre-registration also allows us to identify unpublished studies. It's tricky with a pre-registration because it's possible to pre-register something and then maybe never do it. But it at least gives us a sense as a field of what's going on, and some record of at least what was planned, and can give us a sense of what's going on with publication bias, because we know that not all research that is conducted actually gets published. And again, it will help us distinguish between exploratory and confirmatory research. So confirmatory being this idea of testing a specific hypothesis, exploratory being generating hypotheses. And it's not to say that one of these is really better than the other. I think it's the issue that we're trying to address is that sometimes research is really done in an exploratory way, but then in order to get it published, it's presented in a confirmatory way. And this is really, really important for us as scientists to distinguish so that we can understand the kind of level of evidence that we're seeing for or against a specific hypothesis. So even when you're doing exploratory research, you can pre-register, and our lab does this in particular because we feel like we want a record that says like this was exploratory from the beginning, so that we can't like forget and think that it was confirmatory. The last thing that I want to say is that I really do believe that pre-registration is good for your career. I talked about kind of in the beginning, there's all of this pressure to publish, and researchers are really struggling with kind of implementing or maybe even accidentally using questionable research practices. But there are now, in 2025, there are a lot of incentives for doing this kind of research. And using this approach. So there's evidence that pre-registered studies are cited more. They're published in higher impact journals, and they have a higher altmetric attention score. So this is a score that kind of combines information across social media websites to indicate essentially how much people are talking about these specific papers. And this is particularly helpful. I use this sometimes actually when I have a paper that's been published very recently and I'm trying to argue like this is a really important paper, but citations haven't happened yet because the paper like just got published. But sometimes you can use an altmetric score to kind of indicate the kind of attention that a paper is going to get. This is also super helpful if research gets picked up by the public, right? Because that won't necessarily generate citations, but it does generate a lot of attention on social media. So things like news sites picking up these things and posting on social media should attach the altmetric score. There's this study that I have the citation for in the bottom showed that pre-registered studies do not seem to take any longer to publish. I think they were hoping that they would take shorter to publish, to be honest, but they didn't really find any differences in publication time. So it does seem like pre-registration at least is not taking extra time away from the researchers. Even if they're doing that work up front to do the pre-registration, they're somehow making it up on the back end. Which is great to hear. And then in many senses, sometimes people are concerned about pre-registration because they're worried that it might facilitate scooping. I hope that by talking about the kind of embargo period and how that works, you can see that's not of a great concern. And in some senses, actually, it may discourage scooping because you have a record of when you pre-registered this study, and so you could make an argument that your study was at least planned prior to somebody else conducting a similar study. Scooping is a really difficult thing, and I know it's a deep concern. We'll talk about this more with pre-registration or with registered reports, but especially when resources are thin, it's concerning, this idea of kind of putting your work out there that somebody else might be able to implement faster. And so it's very kind of understandable concern about pre-registration, but I think that the systems that are in place now really make that concern not as concerning as it used to be. So the embargo periods didn't always exist and that kind of thing, but I think now we've kind of ironed out the wrinkles, which is great. And then pre-registered research is perceived as more trustworthy and higher quality. So when readers and reviewers see that research is pre-registered, they are attributing greater kind of quality metrics to that research, which is great for the researchers who are doing it, is that you actually get the credit for all of the work that you've done. Okay, so just to briefly review pre-registration, it's prior to collecting your data or conducting your research, whatever that might look like, you can create this public registration of your research plans, but it doesn't have to be public right away, which is great. It's internally conducted in your team and then posted on a website like Open Science Framework or As Predicted. And it reduces and makes transparent questionable research practices, which is great. So things like p-hacking and harking. It increases reproducibility, replicability, and transparency. And it's good for your career. So that's all super great. Super. So I want to take a moment at this point just to see if there are some questions about pre-registration and what that process looks like, what it is. Oh, it looks like there's just a question about like what the steps are. I'm happy to, maybe I can just like pull up the OSF site because it's actually, I don't know. The first time I did this, I was so surprised how easy it was. Oop. So OSF has this site called OSF Registries. So you can also find other people's registrations on here. So for example, if you were interested in looking at example registrations, there are a ton on here. So you can kind of see what these look like. I can show you what kind of just adding a new one of these, or I have to log into OSF. This is a test of whether I know any of my passwords. It's a real trick. Okay. So the first thing that it'll ask you is whether you want to connect it to another OSF project. So if you've already made an OSF project, which is essentially just a page where you can put stuff related to your research project, and you can say yes or no. I'm going to say no because I don't have a project. And then there's a couple different kinds of pre-registration. So this is kind of the new, what do I call that? The new checkbox thing. So they've changed a little bit how the thing works. So for example, let's say maybe I wanted to do a qualitative pre-registration. That's going to change the fields that show up on the form. And then essentially you can go through and fill out this form, and they've got a lot of different pieces of information. So here you'd say, what are your research aims? You can kind of describe what kind of research you're doing, the research questions, the duration, the design plan, and you're just going through and kind of filling in these little boxes. One of the things that is tricky, I don't know if that's the right word, um, uh, is usually there's kind of only one author of these. So typically once I kind of filled this out, I'll make a little printable version that I'll then send to my co-authors so that they can review it. Because there's usually only one person kind of editing these things. But essentially you go through and you fill out these little boxes, and it feels fun and productive, and just like filling out this online form. The other thing that you can do, and there's a few of these kind of made public, is that people have made these in like a Word document form, so that you can pre-fill it out and save it in a Word document, float it with your research team, and then when you go to this page, you're just copy pasting from that document. So that's what that looks like. I can show you maybe what some of the registrations look like. This is a study we're doing our classes here at UCLA. So when these are filled out, we have like our list of hypotheses, the design plans, some information about blinding, and these are like public access. So now somebody could see what it is that our plan is. And then I think we ended up like uploading a PDF with our analysis plan because it was so intense. So yeah, so that's kind of what these look like in this context. Great question in the chat. Is pre-registration without peer review not a rigorous approach? I think pre-registration is definitely, it's better than nothing, right? So a lot of the time, we're thinking about we don't want to make perfect the enemy of the good in many senses. I typically encourage people to start with pre-registration. Just the process of pre-registration is really valuable. The trouble that sometimes we run into with pre-registration is that even if you make a plan internal to your team, your peer reviewers may not agree with your pre-registration. So this happened actually for one of my graduate students who was working on a project. She pre-registered her study, and then followed her pre-registration. And then when we submitted for peer review, one of the reviewers disagreed with one of the thresholds that we had set because we weren't doing kind of traditional null hypothesis significance testing. And so we found ourselves kind of caught between a rock and a hard place because the peer reviewer wanted one thing, but our pre-registration said another thing. In the end, we did both just to kind of demonstrate both. But to me, that's one of the really good advantages of registered reports, is that it's not just pre-registering internally with your team, but actually it's an agreement with the peer reviewers as well. So it brings in more people, which can be more complicated, but it is definitely can take longer, and it's a more arduous process. So pre-registration definitely better than doing nothing. But registered reports incorporate the peer review into that process. So there are also some advantages of that. Another question in the chat, is there a fee attached to pre-registration? No. So for both OSF and as predicted, these pre-registrations are free. You can do as many or as few as you want. No fee attached, which is super great. Great questions. Okay, so in the next section, I'm going to talk about registered reports. These are, I don't know, what we would call like pre-registration plus. So the idea is it's kind of incorporating the pre-registration process into the peer review process so that all of this happens kind of simultaneously. So in a registered report, we have two stages of peer review. And then, so essentially what happens is you develop the idea, you design the study, and then instead of pre-registering, or kind of in addition to pre-registering really, you submit a manuscript for review. So this manuscript includes like a methods and an introduction, and an analysis plan, or you can have a results section with blanks. And you submit this to a journal. So there's only certain journals that accept these, but that number is growing, and we'll talk about the specific journals. But the idea is now, instead of just submitting a pre-registration into the internet, you actually submit a kind of a document that is similar to a pre-registration to a journal, and it gets peer reviewed. And there's the back and forth between you and the peer reviewers as you decide on what's going on. But there is not like it's not a guarantee that this is going to be accepted from the get-go, but the idea is once you've gone through this process, you can, the journal, if the paper is accepted, then the journal is accepting that paper, what's called an in-principle acceptance, prior to actually knowing the results of the study. So this is particularly beneficial for publication bias. And so once you get this in-principle acceptance, then you can collect and analyze your data, write up the rest of the paper, and then it's submitted for a second stage of peer review. This second stage is a little different than a kind of traditional peer review because they can't really ask for new things. So they can't ask you to collect more data, or they can't ask you to change your analyses because everybody's already agreed on that. So the idea is that they're really just checking whether you did what you said that you were going to do, and looking at the additional kind of sections that have been added to the paper and making sure all of those are like aligned with the claims and the evidence from the study. So who does a registered report? It's similar to a pre-registration in that your whole team is involved, but then there's more people and more things involved. So there is typically a specific journal involved, and the editor and reviewers at that journal. And oftentimes you'll want to get the right people involved in this process from the get-go. So if you typically work with a statistician or a librarian or somebody else throughout that process, it would be a really good idea to get those people involved from the beginning. So registered reports a little different from a pre-registration in that there's a lot of coordination among people, and you're trying to get everybody moving towards this singular goal of this project. So it can feel a little bit more intensive and can take longer because there's more people involved in this process. So when does a registered report happen? The weird thing with registered reports is it's kind of always happening in many senses. So often if you want to do a registered report, you really have to make this decision very early on in the process. I actually just had a meeting with a student yesterday where she's starting a new project, and it's kind of a two-study project. And so I said, are you interested in doing a registered report? And she's like, well, I think I'd like to pre-register the first study, and then kind of depending on how that goes, maybe we'll do a registered report for the second study. So you really have to have those conversations with your team early on. There is a multi-stage process for registered reports, so it's a bit more complex to implement than a pre-registration where you're just doing that kind of one step that goes in before your data collection. So stage one should be at about the same time as a pre-registration. Many journals that accept registered reports will actually require that you submit a pre-registration as part of the in-principle acceptance process. So pre-registration is kind of baked in. And then we also need to account for the review period before collecting data. And this, I think, is maybe one of the most discouraging things for researchers, is that we're used to kind of coming up with an idea and planning the study, and then we immediately get to go and do it. And that feels really good. It feels very rewarding. Registered reports kind of pause that process while you're going through the review period, and it's difficult to adjust to, but I think in some senses, the wait is worth it, especially, if a study is going to be very expensive to run, very resource intensive. You really want to know that the study is going to get published, regardless of how the results come out. I met with a colleague recently who does fMRI research, and they want to do a longitudinal fMRI study with people as they're learning a language. So across the course of a year, they would scan everybody 4 times, it's a very expensive process. He said the study was going to cost something like $30,000. And I said, like, don't you want to register that? Because he was like, what if we don't find anything? And I was like, you should do this as a registered report. Because the wait is worth it to really know that the study is going to get published in the end. And then stage 2, in theory, should be shorter than the stage 1 review process. There's less kind of on the table. Statistically, we so far have not really found this to be the case, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is, I think, something to iron out with registered reports. So we have a little bit of data just internally from our lab where there is a study that we're running where we're surveying researchers who are doing registered reports about every 3 months, and just kind of asking about their review processes. In general, what we found is that the stage 1 review seems to take on average about 7 months. And then the stage 2 review on average seems to take maybe about 5 months. In my opinion, this is too long, and I think that this is a little discouraging. We'll continue to collect data on this and kind of update these numbers, but I just want to be transparent about like what we know so far about how long these processes take. And this is something I work directly actually with some of the psychology journals, and we've given this feedback to them to say, we really need to be streamlining the stage 2 review process in particular. So where do we publish registered reports? I think this is maybe one of the trickiest aspects of registered reports, is that specific journals need to adopt them. Adoption has gone very well, actually, across many different fields. So psychology has really kind of been in the lead on this, but we also see adoption in medicine, social science, neuroscience, business. At this point, there are about 250 journals that have adopted registered reports, and that number keeps growing and growing and growing. Back in 2018, we were only at about, I don't know, maybe a collective 100 or so. And about 450 registered reports published at this point. There are a couple of places that you can go to find lists of journals that publish registered reports. OSF has their list of journals. I've also put a link to the OSF registries here. And our lab has also made a little database that you can use to find a journal. So I just want to point out that a lot of people are concerned that the best journals are not doing registered reports. That may have been the case very early days, but we are finding that very high impact and top journals in a given field have adopted registered reports. So JPSP, which I mentioned previously as being a top social psychology journal, Academy of Management, PLOS Biology, American Journal of Political Science. These are all journals that accept registered reports. And actually now most of the nature journals all accept registered reports. So that's a kind of, at least in my little sub area, very top field, top journals. We have Nature Human Behavior, but there's also Nature and Nature Communications and Nature Climate Science. So all of the nature journals accept these now, which is pretty cool. This is just an example of kind of how our database works. I realized we gave it a little facelift actually recently, so it's not this color anymore. But the basic idea is that you could use this database to find journals that really fit with what it is that you're looking for. So if you wanted to look in a specific scientific discipline or a specific research area, we also have little toggles for you can filter by impact factor or whether they publish replications or multi-study papers. So the idea is that you can use this database to find a journal that will work for you and your needs. So far, it seems like people really like this tool. So if you have any feedback too, we'd love to incorporate new things. I think we now have a toggle for whether or not there's an article processing fee. So you can find journals that don't have fees if that's important for you. So you can kind of find different things that fit with what you need. I want to talk about an alternative to publishing in a journal, which is this newer mechanism called peer community and registered reports. So the idea is you may know that you want to do a registered report, but you don't know what journal you would want to publish in. And peer community and registered reports is a system that reviews registered reports. So it does the peer review process, but it itself is not a journal. And essentially what happens is journals become friendly with PCIRR is the term that they use, they're friendly. And those journals commit to publishing any paper that is reviewed through this process as long as it fits with the scope of their journal. So if I was doing a social psychology study and I wanted it to go into a political science journal, they might not be actually, well, depends. Maybe a climate science journal, maybe that wouldn't fit, but the idea is that they've made a commitment to accepting any papers that are reviewed through this process, which is pretty cool. So it means that you have some options, and it's worthwhile to look at which journals are friendly so that you can tell if there are journals in your field that are friendly. But in theory, you could actually just do this to get the peer reviews and then publish a preprint or something, and then it's a peer-reviewed preprint. So just a couple examples of journals that are friendly with PCIRR. F1000, which is a pretty general journal. The Royal Society for Open Science, which is a general STEM journal. All the Peer J's are friendly with PCIRR. And if there are specific journals that you are like, oh, I wish this journal was friendly with PCIRR, there's a way that they can apply. So you could encourage folks at that journal to become friendly. And you can share information with them about how to do that. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of registered reports, and then I want to talk about kind of why would we do this? It has pretty much all of the same benefits of pre-registration. So registered reports really help with a lot of aspects of reproducibility, transparency, replicability. But also they do a much better job of reducing publication bias. So even when we pre-register studies, that's not a guarantee that it's going to get published. So it's possible that pre-registered studies that don't support their hypotheses are less likely to get published. But with registered reports, they should still get published regardless of whether they support their hypotheses or not. So actually this very recent paper just came out where they looked at these pre-registered studies, and they found that 42% of pre-registered studies were not available or published after 4 years, whether in a journal or even as a preprint. It's kind of interesting to see that maybe just short of half of pre-registered studies are still not getting published. And I think that this is a greater argument for registered reports is that it kind of guarantees that if you're going to go through this process, then you get something for sure at the end. The other thing is that by doing a peer review process at the planning stage, in theory, this could improve your research design. And in general, people have found that these studies tend to have higher statistical power, larger sample sizes. And so if the peer review process works, then in theory, we're doing our research at a higher level, which is great. We can also cut ties with an idea if it doesn't work out. This is a lot of people don't like to talk about this, but every once in a while we have an idea, and then the peer reviewers might say they might really explain to you and convince you that maybe this wasn't a good idea. And I would much rather that be done before I do all of the work than after. So it is, I think, a valuable aspect of registered reports that before you have all of this personal buy-in to the project, you might be able to cut ties with it. It's also used to incentivize other open science practices. So things like open data and replication. So a lot of journals really encourage registered reports to have open data and open code. Almost every journal has very clear policies of like, if there are reasons not to make your data open, then they are willing to kind of accommodate that. So don't worry about that as like a downside. But it's something that is kind of baked into the process, which is great. The other thing that can be a benefit is, so like PCIRR offers what they call a streamlined review process. So you can schedule when you're going to do your stage 1 review. I don't know any other journals that do that, just scheduling peer review. One of my students did this for her dissertation, and she got her reviews back in 8 days. So we scheduled the peer review process a few months in advance. We knew when she was going to do her prelims, her dissertation proposal, and then we planned for her to submit the stage 1 about a month after doing the prelims or proposal stage. And so she submitted, and then like 8 days later, reviews appeared, and it was pretty amazing. The other thing is that registered reports can avoid wasting resources. So sometimes we run a study and it has a problem, and a peer reviewer would be able to identify it, and so we have to rerun the study or collect more data or something like that. So a lot of that can be preempted in the peer review process. And then we have a guaranteed publication even with null results. So especially when we're doing studies that are very risky, or we're worried that they might not work out or are contradictory to the current literature, it's very, very helpful to be able to publish these and make those openly available to others. So I just wanted to give some examples of like what the review process feels like when we don't have registered reports. So it's very common. We kind of develop our idea, design the study, we collect data, we write everything up, and then we get all of these comments that are sometimes we wish we could have them earlier, right? So the peer review process happens very late when we don't have a registered report, even if we do pre-register. And it might say something like, oh, you need to run more or different analyses. Your study's not adequately powered, so you need to run it again with a larger sample. There's a confound in your design, you need to run another study, or everybody's favorite, is this question is uninteresting and not worth exploring. Don't we already know this? So all of these are kind of like real comments, or the idea of a comment that I've received throughout my lifetime. And all of these are things where I think like, I wish I could have known this earlier. I wish I could have gotten this feedback earlier in my process so that I don't have to redo work or, do new work, but just to know what it is that the goal is at the end. So the idea with a registered report is that we're moving a lot of this up into the stage 1 peer review. So we might have to initially plan to run more different analyses or collect a larger sample, or have a confound in our design, let's fix it, or cut ties with an idea. You might be wondering then, like, why do we need the stage 2 review process? So the stage 2 is going to have a kind of different nature of questions where they might ask for exploratory analyses, but you don't always have to do them. Or if the claims from the study are not supported by the data. So for example, maybe you make a mistake and you say, oh, this was significant, but it wasn't. That's the kind of thing that the reviewers are looking at in that stage 2, but they can't ask for these kinds of things on the left at such a late stage. And I find that this is super beneficial because you're getting the right comments at the right time. And I think that this just like de-stresses me about the peer review process, which is really lovely. Okay, so why do we do this? Well, one of the reasons why registered reports are so beneficial is that they're both transparent and reproducible. So the process of pre-registration is already embedded in registered reports. So we have the pre-registration in there. Compared to traditional papers, so papers that are not registered reports, research has shown that they tend to have more open data and open code. And also a higher proportion of the published registered reports are replication studies. So we are really prioritizing and putting open science first in these types of publications. And I think that that is super beneficial for establishing a new system that we can feel really proud of as scientists and something that is going to result in more reproducible and replicable research. The last question of why I said that pre-registration was good for your career, and I feel very, very confident about that. I would like to think that registered reports are good for your career, but I'm going to be 100% transparent here and say that we're still not sure, I think. So one kind of qualitative result that we found is that researchers seem to be able to get into higher tier journals than they might otherwise be able to. And there are some really great examples if you look at registered reports published in Nature Human Behavior. We looked at the authors of those papers, and none of them had published in that journal previously. Whereas if you look at the other papers that are published around the same time, many of those authors have published in that journal previously. So there's something about a registered report that seems to maybe be able to get you into a higher tier journal than you might otherwise be able to, which is pretty cool. So that seems good for your career, I think. If you care about getting into high tier journals, we might not all care. Registered research is perceived as higher quality and very rigorous. So external people really do see this, and especially when you're applying for jobs or going up for tenure or any of these kind of evaluation processes, these kinds of research are really perceived very positively, which is great. There is greater attention on Twitter, but only seemingly in lower impact journals, which is a kind of interesting new finding that just came out a couple months ago, where they looked at essentially whether registered reports are cited more or get more of this altmetric attention. They didn't really find the effects with the altmetric attention. They did find it in Twitter, but only in papers that were in lower impact journals. So you can imagine maybe if your choice is between publishing in a lower impact journal, a registered report, or not, maybe a registered report is going to get you a little bit more attention on the Twitter sphere for whatever that's worth. I feel like I've abandoned Twitter. So, but this data is a little bit older, so Twitter was still the thing. I do want to acknowledge, though, that registered reports do have some cons. So I think the main thing that we find is that the time cost is a really big concern, especially for early career researchers, and they just don't always work in the timeline that trainees have, for their training or a postdoc or something like that. Because the peer review process can really delay the research. If there's not enough time to go through that peer review process, then I don't know that it is always going to work. So in our lab in general, we always kind of ask, can this be a registered report? But not everything can be a registered report in what we do. Whether that's because this is somebody's dissertation and they really need to get this done in a specific amount of time. And the peer review process can be highly variable. I did mention previously the peer community in registered reports seems to have found some way to address this a little bit, but it's not a guarantee. So I just want to acknowledge that there are, I would say, pros and cons. Great. So let's stop here for questions about registered reports. Oh, good. There's lots of activity in the chat. William, you've been busy, which is great. Talked about registrations, fees.
Yeah, so I have a question, Amanda.
Yes.
Yeah, so you did say that registered reports do go through a review process, right? And
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there could also be biases during that process because it's kind of the same reviewers that are reviewing journal applications that are also reviewing this. And is it possible that there will still be bias, especially for researchers coming from the global south?
Yeah, I think this is a real concern and something that I don't know if we know yet, but I also don't think that we can say like, oh, well, it doesn't exist until we know, right? Um, there's very clearly documented biases that occur in grant reviews, and I think this process of a registered report is quite similar to a grant review, where especially some journals are make very explicit that you're evaluating whether you think the team can do the research. Um, and that is, I think, a big concern with registered reports. It's something that PCIRR makes very explicit that they are not evaluating. So I think PCIRR is a great mechanism, especially for folks who are concerned about bias, because they make it very explicit that this is not to be evaluated, it's not to be commented on. And the idea is, and I think that this is the spirit of a registered report, which is if you say that you can do this, we're gonna hold you to it. And we're not gonna have to evaluate like, can you do this or will you do this? It's just like we're making a commitment as a journal, we're making a commitment to you to say, if you do this, then we'll publish it. And that should not be affected by where somebody is in the world or anything like that. Um, I think some other journals are maybe not as mindful about this, and I think it's something to draw attention to if we see this come up in the review process. Um, but yeah, I think PCIRR is a great mechanism because they're very thoughtful about this issue. Um, but I do think that maybe at other journals it might not necessarily be as they're not as forward thinking about these issues for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
And there's another good one that's in the chat that's asking about registered reports is good when you already master the experiment versus maybe a novel. I don't know if you want to touch on that real fast.
Yeah, so this is a really common concern, and I think I gave an example of this actually earlier, where you might want to, especially if you have a multi-study paper where maybe you're piloting a new method or something that is really novel to your lab, it's probably in your best interest to get some experience with that prior to doing a registered report. So I was talking to a graduate student who's planning a study in my lab, and we're using the same materials across the two studies. So our thinking is pre-register the first study so that we have the time and resources to develop the materials, and then we're really going to test them in a registered report. But yeah, it is tricky sometimes to do a registration of something that is so novel. So you can have pilot studies in a registered report. You can have work that you've already done, but there needs to be at least one study that you haven't done yet. And many journals will actually ask for some of this piloting work to be done during that stage one process prior to giving the in-principle acceptance. So definitely doing the piloting work in advance is a really, really good idea. Hand raise, I'm probably going to mispronounce your name. I'm sorry, Elaine.
Yes, yes. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah. It's just
I'm not.
just a control. Just do a sign. It's difficult for you to if you go to do the pre-registration, you are going to have a lot of you are not sure because you can design a study according to the literature review. But when you want to run the experiment, because you are new, you face to a lot of unexpected results. Sometimes you cannot succeed to induce the model. Like for example, now I'm just working to the new model. I do a good literature review, but is the model I not succeed to induce the model. The rat die and so far. So I need to master the procedure of data collection. So I think when it's a new experiment, it's good to do pre-registration. Yeah, for example, in OSF. So you can go and OSF, edit, change the procedure. It's possible with OSF. But when you already master your model, your procedure, you can at that time do registration report for the second or other experiment. Yeah, that's what I want to contribute. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's super, super helpful. Yeah, this idea that if it's a really new procedure for you or a new model or something that you're working with that's very new, it would probably be very difficult to write a stage one plan, right? Because there's so much that we learn as scientists as we're doing these processes. So I think it's a great point that there are times when you want to do a pre-registration and times when you want to do a registered report. And it's not that one is better than another, and our lab does a mix of all of these things. So yeah, I think it's a great point that, especially when we're unfamiliar with the methods that we're using, pre-registration or even treating it as kind of exploratory and saying like, I don't know what's going to happen. That's also totally okay. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Super. So I had a couple slides in here about just kind of comparing pre-registration and registered reports. We've talked a lot about these. Just in general, a lot of the questions are kind of this nature. When do I do one versus the other, which is, I think, a really great question. I want to point out one thing just around time, which is that pre-registrations are typically a better option when you are under some kind of time constraint. So an example of this might be, you need to do data collection right at the beginning of the academic year, for example. I work with education researchers who have to do this all the time, where they are they have to do the data collection at the beginning of the academic year, or they have to wait till another academic year. So that's really important. And sometimes pre-registration is the best option in those cases. If you already know data collection is just about to start and you want to do something, then a pre-registration is a great thing to do. Registered reports tend to be a better option when you still have time to make changes to the study. So it may be that the reviewers are going to ask for revisions to the procedures. If that's not possible, then it might not be a good idea to do a registered report. But if you still have time to make changes, I think that that's a great time to do a registered report. They have similar advantages. So both are going to make your hypotheses transparent. Neither of these are going to tie your hands. We haven't talked that much about deviations, but deviations from pre-registrations and registered reports are normal. I handle registered reports at 3 different journals. I don't think I've published a single one or I don't think I've handled a single one that didn't deviate. I don't think I've published a single one that didn't deviate, at least a little bit from our plan. So it's about making those deviations transparent so that the rationale for them can be evaluated by the reader. So you can deviate from your plans and explore interesting findings. Just make those deviations transparent. The last thing that I want to mention a little bit is just that analysis planning is tricky. It's very, very tricky. This is, I think, one of the most difficult skills, like when you don't have data in front of you and you're trying to plan how you're going to analyze it. It is possible to plan an analysis in advance that is not appropriate for your data. The first registered report that I worked on, we had an incomplete factorial design. So we had kind of this, you would think of it like a 2x3 rectangle, but not all of the cells had data in them. But I kind of overlooked that and I just wrote the analysis plan as if we were going to have a complete design. And then when we got the data, I was like, oh gosh, I totally forgot. in the end, we just explained to the reviewers, why we did something different, and it was totally fine. But just because you make a plan doesn't mean it's a good plan. Something just to think in mind. I do think that this is more problematic for pre-registration than registered reports, because at least your peer reviewers are going to look at your plan and they might weigh in on whether it's a good plan. And it also, I think sometimes if you have a pre-registered plan and then you submit a paper with a different plan, unless you make it very transparent in the paper, then people might have lots of questions about that. It's very important to think about the edge cases. So what happens if your model doesn't converge, or what happens if you have missing data? What if the analyses don't turn out as expected? So it's important to think about like how variables are measured, how you'll combine them. What if that combination doesn't have good properties like good reliability? Think about missing data, exclusion criteria, and multiple comparisons, as well as positive checks. So things that you might look at even prior to doing your analyses. I think I saw there was a question. I'm like hearing the little pop.
Yeah.
Oh,
yes. Yep, that's me. So thank you. I mean, it's an amazing session. It opened our eyes to so many things. But my question is that because we've also been interacting with Octopus. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them.
No.
Yeah, and they're sort of, I think what they're doing is sort of like pre-registration, because the idea is that you publish even from your hypothesis, moving on, and then it allows for the idea, for
like
example,
the living document kind of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then it can be reviewed. So I was wondering, is this like the same sort of as pre-registration or registered reports, or it's not really considered like that?
I think it could be considered a pre-registration. Sorry, this is probably going to pop up in my share screen. Oops. As long as everything is time stamped, that would be my only kind of like big question is whether the change, if there's like track changes or something, then yeah, this could be treated like a pre-registration. And I think this idea of kind of transitioning to these more like notebook-based and living document-based approaches to science, I'm very excited about these, because I think that it's a new way to think about the way that we publish research, and can definitely facilitate, especially reproducibility, because like the code and everything is all baked into the same document, which is I think really lovely. So this is a great resource for sure. Yeah, great. I heard the little hand thing again, but for some reason
I wanted to weigh in on the discussion on Octopus. I think so. What Octopus is trying to do is to kind of make their whole research process transparent in terms of the steps, like the pre-planning, then doing the actual work, the methodology, the data analysis. It's trying to split all of them together. But I think maybe the difference between maybe that and pre-registration is that pre-registration may require you to provide information about, like, let's say, the various steps that you want to go to. But Octopus is like, okay, you are trying to do your research and publish your work, right? But you can do bits at a time. So what you have now, maybe the initial abstract of something, you can put it down, then you can work on it bit by bit. Like, okay, you can publish only the let's say the introductory section, then you can go on with the, let's say, the methodology, then you can have different authors like doing various aspects of the research publication. So it's like making the whole process split up, transparent, but connected, where people can get credit for their contributions for various aspects of the work. So it's not so different, but it's a bit different because pre-registration, like, okay, this is what I want to do from A to Z. Everything is there, but I've not actually done the work yet. But Octopus is, I'm doing the work and I'm kind of publishing it even before I complete it. Like, I've done this part, I've published it. I've done this part, I've published it. And then at the end, they are all connected. So it's a wonderful system, a way of making it open and transparent. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's great, because I think a lot of times we forget all the steps that we took. So it's really nice to have these systems to keep track. So I know we're bumping up right on the time. So there's some extra slides in here just about like specific advice if you're doing secondary data analysis or qualitative analysis. And I'm happy to answer questions about those as well. But I just want to give kind of a brief summary of what we've talked about today. So in general, we got pretty interested in these things because of questionable research practices and publication bias, and how these can reduce the replicability and reproducibility and transparency of our own research. We see pre-registration and registered reports as a way to address a lot of these concerns. Obviously, there are lots of other tools as well to address many of these. We kind of saw these as like the first thing that you might adopt or really try to incorporate into a lab or an environment that you're establishing, because they really do govern a lot of the way that you do research and the timing of things and that kind of thing. So in many senses, it's kind of the idea of you would build a system around, pre-registration and registered reports. And then there's a lot of shared features between these two approaches, but they also differ in important ways. And depending on your project, the timeline, how the project is going to look, you might choose one over the other. And there are situations where we choose pre-registration and situations where we choose registered reports. And then last, like both practices produce a lot of benefits, and many benefit the research itself. So the transparency and reproducibility and replicability of that research, but also there are a lot of benefits for the researcher in terms of the vision of the quality of the research that you're producing, the publishability of that research as well. So there's a lot of benefits, I think, to the researcher and the research. So I have a couple extra resources in the back end here, with just like extra resources for registered reports, and then references for papers. I think I already even saw one PDF in the chat, so that's great. And last, I just want to say thank you so much for having us, and really great discussion today. I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes for questions. And you're also welcome to contact me. I have my email here. I've kind of abandoned Twitter, so I'm on Blue Sky these days, and I'm also on LinkedIn. And we have a website with a lot of resources for registered reports. So if you ever are trying to find the database or something like that, you can always find it on my webpage. So yeah, thank you so much, and really great to have everybody here, and great discussion, and happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. This is the first 2-hour session we've done since our local naturally training program last year. So it was wonderful, and it was lengthy for some people, especially. This is we normally do 1-hour sessions, but it was great. We had a lot of information. We've learned a lot, and we are so grateful that you also made the opportunity. And thank you everyone for spending the 2 hours here. We know it was lengthy, but yeah, you've stuck around, and thank you so much for sticking around. And have a wonderful day. So I'm going to stop the recording, but I think Amanda, you've been sticking around to, let's say, answer questions that anyone has. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And have a wonderful evening. It's getting late here. It could be afternoon somewhere, but have a wonderful day, everyone. Yeah.